She went into the mountains for research and lost her way. What she found there wasn't on any map. A house that survived what killed others. This story isn't about luck. It's about a decision made too late, and a system that worked when everything else failed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. By the time she realized how quietly everything had gone wrong, it was already too late to pretend it was only fatigue. The signs had been there for years, layered one over another. Small concessions disguised as professional maturity, compromises explained away as pragmatism. She had learned to speak in careful language, to soften conclusions, to frame warnings as recommendations rather than limits. It was how one survived in her field. It was how projects moved forward. And for a long time, she had told herself that this was still a form of protection, that working within the system allowed her to prevent the worst outcomes, even if she could not stop all of them. Her name was Mara Collins, and for more than 2 decades, she had been an environmental scientist specializing in cold region ecosystems and human impact in climatically fragile zones. She had walked thawing permafrost in Alaska, measured soil respiration in high-altitude valleys in Colorado, consulted on winter infrastructure in northern Montana and Wyoming. She understood numbers, models, and probabilities better than most people understood their own habits. She had built a career on restraint, on precision, on the ability to translate complex natural processes into language that could be approved, funded, and implemented. The last project had been no different at first, a proposed ecotourism development in a mountainous region that marketing materials described as pristine and untouched. Lodges designed to blend into the landscape, minimal road access, renewable energy sources carefully highlighted in glossy presentations. On paper, it was the kind of project Mara was often asked to validate, a balance between economic opportunity and environmental responsibility. She had accepted the contract with professional neutrality, flown out for preliminary assessments, and begun her work with the same diligence she always applied. What she found in the field had unsettled her more than she expected. The region was not untouched. It was vulnerable. Snow accumulation patterns had shifted in the last decade. Wind corridors funneled cold air into narrow valleys where temperatures dropped sharply and unpredictably. Emergency access in winter would be limited to hours, not minutes. Any structure built there would need to survive extended isolation, prolonged sub-zero temperatures, and complete loss of external support. In her notes, she had flagged these risks clearly. In her draft report, she had stated them plainly. Certain types of development, she wrote, were incompatible with the realities of the environment, not unprofitable, unsafe. The final version of the report had arrived in her inbox 3 weeks later, already formatted and approved. Her name was on the cover. Her credentials followed in neat lines beneath the title. But the language had changed. Critical sections had been softened, probabilities reframed, worst-case scenarios removed entirely. The conclusions now suggested mitigation rather than limitation, adaptation rather than avoidance. The document implied that with sufficient planning, all challenges could be managed. She had read it twice before she understood what had been done. The science had not been falsified. It had been diluted. The danger had not been denied. It had been made abstract. When she called the project coordinator, the response was polite and practiced. Adjustments had been made for clarity, she was told. For alignment with stakeholder expectations, her concerns were still represented, just in a way that allowed progress. Progress, Mara had learned, was the word most often used when responsibility was being shifted forward, away from the present moment and onto an undefined future. That night, she had slept poorly. Not because of anger, but because of something more corrosive. Recognition. She had seen this pattern before. She had participated in it. Each time, she had justified her role by telling herself that refusing would only mean someone less cautious would take her place, that her presence, even compromised, was better than absence. It was a comforting logic, and it had sustained her career. But now, reading her own name attached to conclusions she did not believe, she felt the weight of what that logic cost. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings and emails. She answered questions about the report with careful phrasing, redirecting specifics, avoiding absolutes. Colleagues congratulated her on another successful project. She smiled when expected, nodded when required. But the language she used felt increasingly foreign to her, as though she were reciting lines from a script written long ago by someone else. At night, she dreamed of cold. Not dramatic storms or cinematic disasters, but a quiet, creeping cold that moved inward, unnoticed, until it was everywhere. She would wake with the sensation still lingering, a tightness in her chest that took minutes to fade. It was during one of these nights that she made the decision she would later realize had been inevitable. She would take a leave, not a sabbatical, not a formal research expedition, but time away from the system entirely. She told her department she needed to conduct independent field observations to recalibrate her ongoing work. The explanation was accepted without much scrutiny. No one questioned the need for data. It was one of the few justifications that required no further defense. She chose a region she knew well, one she had helped classify years earlier as low impact and low priority for development, a place that existed mostly in footnotes and satellite imagery. The timing was late autumn, the season most people avoided, when winter arrived without ceremony and weather forecasts grew unreliable. She prepared carefully but without excess. She brought what she trusted, not what promised comfort. Satellite communicator, layered clothing, a modest shelter, enough food for contingencies. She did not plan to test herself. She planned to observe. The first days on the trail were uneventful. The land felt stripped of pretense. Trees stood bare and honest, their branches etched against a pale sky. Snow came and went in light intervals, enough to soften sound, but not enough to erase direction. Mara moved steadily, measuring her pace by breath and daylight rather than distance. Without meetings or deadlines, time stretched and loosened its grip. She found herself noticing details she had not consciously registered in years. The way wind scoured certain slopes, clean, while piling snow deep in others. The subtle warmth retained in rock faces long after sunset. On the fourth day, the weather shifted. The change was not dramatic. No sudden wall of cloud or plunging barometer, but a gradual tightening of the air, a sense of pressure building without release. Snow began to fall more steadily, thicker flakes that blurred edges and muted contrast. Visibility shortened. Mara adjusted her route, following terrain rather than markers, trusting her experience to guide her. By late afternoon, she realized she had drifted farther west than intended. The map still made sense in theory, but the land beneath her boots no longer matched it precisely. Snow disguised familiar contours, filled depressions, softened ridgelines. She stopped, recalculated, considered turning back, then dismissed the thought. The conditions were manageable. She had navigated worse. It was when she paused to rest that she noticed the anomaly. At first, she thought it was her breath, rising and dissipating unevenly. But then she saw it again, faint but persistent, a slow exhalation of warmth rising from a hollow ahead. Steam, or something like it, moving upward through falling snow. It made no sense. There were no geothermal features mapped here, no human structures, no reason for heat to exist in that place. Curiosity stirred, sharpened by professional instinct. Heat meant energy. Energy meant activity. And activity, in a zone classified as dormant, meant an error in her understanding or someone else's. She adjusted her course slightly and moved toward it, cautious but alert. As she approached, the source became clearer. Not a plume, but a subtle disturbance. Snow thinning where something beneath it resisted the cold. The shape that emerged from the white was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It seemed to belong there in a way that unsettled her more than if it had stood out. A structure, low and dark, partially embraced by the land rather than imposed upon it. She stopped several meters away, heart steady but attentive. Whatever she was seeing had not been accounted for in any report she had written or reviewed. It was not on her map. It was not supposed to exist. And yet it did, quietly, persistently, releasing just enough warmth to mark its presence against the cold. She took one step closer, unaware that this deviation, small and deliberate, marked the point beyond which her understanding of systems, both environmental and human, would begin to unravel. Mara stood still long enough for the snow to begin settling on her shoulders, thin white grains gathering in the seams of her jacket, before she realized she had stopped breathing properly. It was not fear that held her in place, but a professional dissonance so sharp it demanded stillness. Everything she knew taught her that what lay ahead should not exist. Heat sources in this elevation and latitude did not go unnoticed. They left signatures in vegetation, in melt patterns, in soil chemistry. And yet here it was, modest and undeniable, altering the air around it in ways her instruments hadn't predicted. She moved again, slowly now, each step deliberate, as though the ground itself might object to her presence. The closer she came, the clearer the structure became, not emerging abruptly from the snow, but revealing itself in layers. First a dark line where snow thinned and slid away, then the suggestion of a wall, low and uneven, its surface absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The building did not rise so much as it settled, crouched into the land, as if it had always been part of the slope and had merely waited for someone to notice. What struck her first was what was missing. There were no tracks leading to it, no path worn by repeated passage. The snow around the structure was smooth and unbroken, except for a narrow disturbance near one side, where warmth had softened the surface just enough to prevent full accumulation. No smoke rose into the air in the way she expected. There was no column to mark a chimney, no sharp contrast against the sky. Whatever heat this place produced, it did so quietly, without announcement. She circled the structure at a careful distance, reading it the way she would read a landscape feature. The walls appeared to be built from local materials, stone and timber darkened by age and weather, arranged without ornament or symmetry. The roofline was barely discernible beneath the snow, sloping gently, its form dictated by gravity and load rather than aesthetics. It was not the kind of shelter designed to be seen. It was designed to endure. Her first instinct was caution. She had not come prepared to encounter another person, and isolation had its own unspoken rules. But the weather was worsening. Snow fell more densely now, the light flattening, depth perception slipping away. Even with her experience, she knew better than to ignore a refuge in such conditions, however unexpected it might be. She called out once, her voice sounding strangely loud in the muted air. There was no response. She waited, listening not for words, but for movement, for any sign that the structure was occupied. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, a sound reached her, not from within the walls but from beneath them, a subtle shift, like stone expanding or contracting, a quiet acknowledgement of warmth at work. It was only when she stepped closer to what she realized was an entrance that she saw the door. It was set low, partially recessed, its frame worn smooth by time rather than frequent use. Before she could knock, it opened. The man who stood there did not match any expectation she had formed in the seconds before. He was elderly, that much was clear, his hair white and thinning, his posture slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp, assessing rather than startled. He wore simple clothing, layered and practical, without any of the improvisation or excess she associated with long-term isolation. He looked as though he belonged precisely where he was. He did not ask her who she was or how she had found him. He glanced briefly at the sky, then back at her, and stepped aside. The gesture was not inviting so much as obvious, a silent acknowledgement of circumstance. The weather did not care for explanations, and neither, it seemed, did he. Inside, the air changed immediately. The cold did not vanish, but it retreated, easing its grip in a way that felt almost courteous. The temperature was even, unremarkable in its comfort, without the sharp gradients of a fire-heated space. There was no smell of smoke, no crackle of burning wood, no visible source of heat at all. The room was spare but orderly, its contents arranged with purpose rather than minimalism. Everything had a reason to exist. Mara removed her pack and gloves, her movements automatic, but her attention was elsewhere. She could feel warmth beneath her boots, subtle but present, rising not from a point, but from the space itself. She knelt briefly, pressing a hand to the floor, then stopped herself, aware of how that must look. The man watched her without comment, his expression neither amused nor defensive. "You can stay until the weather clears," he said at last. His voice was calm, unaccented in a way that suggested years of deliberate neutrality. "It will get worse before it gets better." She nodded, still taking in the space. She introduced herself, offering her name and profession out of habit more than necessity. He acknowledged the information with a slight inclination of his head, but did not respond in kind. He did not offer his name, and she did not ask. The silence between them was not awkward. It was functional. As the light outside faded, the storm intensified. Wind pressed against the structure without finding purchase, sliding over it, rather than striking it directly. Snow piled deeper, insulating rather than threatening. Mara sat on a simple bench and let the warmth settle into her muscles, her body recognizing safety even as her mind raced to understand it. She began to observe, not overtly, but with the practiced subtlety of someone used to gathering information without intrusion. Air flowed gently through the space, entering and exiting without drafts. The walls radiated a steady temperature, neither cold nor hot. There was a faint sound beneath it all, not mechanical, but geological, the sound of materials interacting with time and heat. Later, when they shared a simple meal, she asked no direct questions. She spoke instead of the weather, of the trail conditions, of how quickly things could change in these elevations. The man listened, occasionally responding, his comments precise and unembellished. He did not romanticize the landscape or complain about it. He spoke of it as a system, one that rewarded understanding and punished assumption. As the night deepened, Mara found herself increasingly aware of how easily she was breathing. In other shelters she had known, warmth came with trade-offs: smoke, dryness, uneven heat. Here, there was none of that. The comfort was almost unsettling in its absence of effort. She slept deeply, without dreams, and woke to the sound of silence so complete it felt physical. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then the warmth beneath her, steady and patient, reminded her. She rose and stepped outside briefly, shielding her eyes against the brightness. The storm had buried the landscape entirely. Drifts reached nearly to the roofline. Any thought of continuing her journey was absurd. When she returned inside, the man was tending to something in an adjacent space she had not yet explored. Not a fire, she realized, but its consequence. Stones, arranged with care, held a residual warmth that spoke of energy stored rather than consumed. She watched him for a long moment, understanding dawning slowly, not as revelation, but as alignment. The deviation she had taken from her planned route had brought her to a place that challenged everything she thought she knew about sustainability, about resilience, about what it meant to live within limits rather than against them. She had not come looking for answers. But as the snow pressed down and the hidden house held its quiet ground, she began to sense that the questions she had avoided for years were waiting for her here, patient and unavoidable, warming the air one careful degree at a time. Morning arrived without the usual signs that Mara associated with waking in the wild. There was no sharp contrast between the warmth of her sleeping bag and the bite of the air beyond it, no moment of hesitation before exposing her hands or face. The temperature in the room had not changed perceptibly through the night. It was as if time itself had slowed inside the walls, smoothing the edges of hours that outside would have been defined by cold and wind. She lay still for several minutes, listening. The silence was layered rather than empty. Beneath it ran a low, almost imperceptible resonance, a quiet dialogue between materials. Stone expanding by fractions of a degree, air moving along paths designed for it, heat releasing itself with patience rather than urgency. It reminded her less of a shelter and more of an organism at rest. When she sat up, the floor beneath her bare feet was cool, but not cold, the kind of coolness that suggested stability rather than neglect. She moved slowly, conscious of the man's presence somewhere beyond the main room, unwilling to disturb the rhythm of the place with unnecessary noise. Her habits as a field scientist asserted themselves gently. Observe first. Interfere later. The light filtering in was diffuse, reflected rather than direct, softened by snow packed thick against the outer contours of the house. Mara crossed to the wall and placed her palm against it, keeping it there longer than strictly necessary. The stone held warmth not at the surface, but just beneath it, a stored memory rather than an active burn. She closed her eyes and imagined the gradients, the way heat must be traveling through layers of material, slowed and guided, never allowed to rush. She had studied thermal mass in academic contexts, run simulations, reviewed case studies from cold climate architecture programs. None of them had prepared her for the simplicity of what she was feeling. There was no sense of excess here, no waste, no struggle. The man emerged quietly from the adjacent space, carrying a small container of water that sent a faint thread of steam into the air. He set it down, nodding once in acknowledgement of her presence, then began a series of movements that were clearly routine. He adjusted something near the floor, checked a vent she had not noticed before, and paused, listening with the same attentiveness she had practiced moments earlier. "You sleep," he said, not as a question, but an observation. "Very well," she replied. It felt inadequate, but it was the truth. He gave a small nod, as though confirming a calculation. Only then did she realize how little they had spoken since her arrival, how much had been communicated without words. She found herself reluctant to break that balance, but the questions pressing at the edges of her mind demanded some form of expression. "I don't see a stove," she said finally. "No," he answered. "You won't." She waited, allowing space for elaboration if he chose to offer it. He did not, at least, not immediately. Instead, he poured the heated water into a simple cup and handed it to her. The warmth seeped into her fingers slowly, echoing the environment itself. "Heat is here," he said, gesturing not upward or outward, but downward, tapping the floor lightly with the side of his boot. "Not in one place. Everywhere." Mara followed his motion, her gaze tracing the lines she had only half perceived the night before. The floor was not uniform. Subtle variations in texture hinted at pathways beneath, channels hidden from view. She crouched, examining the surface more closely, noting how some areas retained warmth longer than others, how the air above them moved just a fraction differently. "You separated the fire," she said, more statement than inquiry. "Yes." "From the living space?" "Yes." The simplicity of the answers was disarming. She straightened slowly, feeling the familiar shift from curiosity to understanding begin its careful ascent. Separation of hazard and benefit, decoupling risk from necessity. It was a principle she had advocated in environmental impact assessments for years, usually in abstract terms. Here, it was embodied. They spent the morning in quiet coexistence. The man tended to his routines, which involved far less activity than Mara would have expected in such conditions. There was no constant feeding of a fire, no frantic adjustments to compensate for temperature swings. Instead, he checked systems the way one checks on a sleeping child, with attention rather than urgency. Mara moved through the house with increasing confidence, mapping it mentally. The walls were thick, not just in dimension but in intent. They did not insulate by exclusion alone, but by participation, absorbing heat when it was abundant, releasing it when it was not. Snow pressed against the exterior, not as a threat, but as a collaborator, sealing gaps, reducing loss. She realized that what many designs treated as an adversary had been reclassified here as a resource. At some point, without ceremony, the man began to explain. Not in the language of engineering or science, but in practical terms, shaped by years of trial and error. He spoke of stone as something that remembered, of earth as a regulator rather than an obstacle. He described the way heat preferred to move, and how one could persuade it otherwise, not through force, but through patience and containment. Mara listened, occasionally asking for clarification, never interruption. Each sentence he offered aligned with principles she knew, but assembled them in ways she had never seen applied outside of textbooks or controlled experiments. There were no measurements cited, no references named. The evidence was the room itself, the steady comfort that did not falter, even as the storm continued to assert itself beyond the walls. As the day progressed, the weather worsened. Wind howled over the buried structure. Snow compacted further, increasing the pressure against the exterior. Inside, the temperature remained unchanged. Mara found herself marking the hours not by light or cold, but by the subtle rhythm of heat release, the way the floor's warmth ebbed and returned, with a predictability that suggested intention. She thought of the projects she had worked on, the models that assumed constant inputs, continuous energy supply, perfect maintenance. This house required none of that. It functioned on cycles rather than streams, on accumulation rather than consumption. It assumed scarcity and planned for it, rather than pretending abundance would always arrive on schedule. Late in the afternoon, she stepped outside briefly. Tethered by a rope the man insisted upon without explanation. The cold struck her immediately, sharp and uncompromising. Snow stung her face, visibility reduced to a handful of meters. She turned back after only a minute, heart pounding, lungs burning. The contrast was startling. Crossing the threshold again felt like passing between worlds. Inside, warmth reclaimed her without ceremony. There was no rush, no blast of heat, just a gradual easing of tension she had not fully recognized until it began to fade. She removed her outer layers and sat heavily, shaken not by fear, but by recognition. That evening, as darkness settled indistinguishably over snow and sky, the man spoke more of his system, though still without personal context. He described how little fuel it required, how rarely it needed tending. Twice a day, sometimes once, depending on conditions. He spoke of storms that lasted longer than forecasts admitted, of weeks when the world beyond these walls ceased to matter. Mara realized she was witnessing something that had never appeared in any of her reports, not because it was hidden, but because it didn't fit the frameworks through which she had been trained to see. This house did not optimize for efficiency in the way grant proposals demanded. It optimized for survival without escalation, for continuity without intervention. When she finally lay down to sleep again, the questions she carried were different from those she had brought with her. They were no longer about how such a system functioned. That she was beginning to understand. What unsettled her was why systems like this were absent from the conversations she had spent her career shaping. As the warmth beneath her steadied into its nocturnal rhythm, Mara sensed the quiet emergence of a deeper conflict, one that extended beyond this buried house and into the structures she herself had helped build. And though the storm outside showed no sign of relenting, she knew with a certainty that surprised her that the real pressure was no longer coming from the cold. The storm continued through the night with a persistence that felt deliberate, as though the mountains themselves were testing the limits of whatever had dared to settle among them. Mara woke once to the sound of wind pressing hard against the buried contours of the house, a low, sustained force that never quite became violence. The structure answered with stillness. Heat remained constant, patient, neither retreating nor flaring in defiance. When she drifted back into sleep, it was with the uneasy awareness that she had entered a place where endurance was not an emergency response, but a state of being. Morning brought no light worth noting. The sky beyond the narrow apertures was a uniform pale gray, indistinguishable from the snow it pressed upon. The man moved through the house with the same measured economy as before, but something in his posture had shifted. He lingered near the floor, openings longer, listened more intently, as if weighing information too subtle for instruments. When he finally spoke, it was not to explain the system further, but to acknowledge the storm's refusal to relent. "It will hold," he said, not reassuringly, but as one states a fact already verified. "But this is the kind of weather that shows you what you didn't plan for." Mara nodded, understanding that the comment applied as much to people as to structures. She watched him prepare the morning routine, a brief tending of the external chamber that required no urgency, only attention. When he returned, bringing with him the faintest trace of the outside cold, he paused, considering her, then gestured for her to follow him into the adjacent space she had not yet fully explored. The room beyond was smaller, utilitarian, its purpose immediately clear. Stone dominated the space, stacked and shaped with the same care evident throughout the house. Heat lingered there more strongly, not in a way that burned or dazzled, but with a density that suggested accumulation. Mara felt it settle into her bones as she stood just inside the threshold. "This is where it begins," he said, "but it doesn't stay here." She did not ask how long he had been here, or why he had chosen this place. Instead, she asked the question that had been forming since the previous evening, the one that bridged professional understanding and personal curiosity. "What made you build it this way?" For a long moment, he did not answer. He adjusted a stone that had shifted minutely, pressed his palm against a surface, as if checking for a pulse, then straightened slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no hesitation, only the weight of something long settled. "I built it because the other way killed someone," he said. The simplicity of the statement left no room for dramatization. Mara waited, careful not to fill the silence that followed. Outside, the wind surged again, punctuating the moment without intruding upon it. "He was my partner," the man continued. "Not in business, in work. We were contracted together for a seasonal project. Temporary housing, standard setup, Rated for the climate, according to the paperwork. Mara recognized the phrasing immediately. Rated for the climate. It was a phrase she had seen countless times, usually attached to assumptions rather than evidence. There was fuel, he went on. There was a stove. There were procedures. Everything that was supposed to be there was there. But the system assumed conditions would behave. It assumed the storm would pass. It assumed someone would wake in time. He did not describe the death in detail. He did not need to. The outline was enough. A fire that burned too quickly, heat that dissipated when attention lapsed, cold that arrived quietly, without announcement. Mara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the same sensation that had followed her reading of altered reports and softened conclusions. He died inside a structure designed to keep him alive, the man said. That is not an accident. That is a failure of design. The words resonated with an uncomfortable precision. Mara thought of the last project she had signed off on, the phrases she had allowed to remain unchallenged. Mitigation, acceptable risk, probability thresholds. I didn't blame the weather, he continued. Weather does what it does. I blamed the idea that survival is something you manage moment to moment, instead of something you build into the ground. He fell silent then, returning his attention to the stones, as though the story had reached its necessary conclusion. Mara found herself unable to speak for several minutes. When she did, her voice surprised her with its steadiness. So, you left. Yes. Not in anger, she realized. Not in retreat. In refusal. I didn't want another temporary solution, he said. Temporary is fine when failure costs time. It's unacceptable when it costs lives. She followed him back into the main room, her mind turning over the implications of what he had said. This house was not an experiment. It was a conclusion, a final answer to a question he had no intention of revisiting. As the day wore on, the storm intensified further, and with it came a deeper understanding of the house's philosophy. There was no attempt to dominate the conditions outside, no overcompensation, no escalation. The system assumed scarcity and planned accordingly. It did not rely on continuous input, on vigilance through exhaustion, on heroics in the night. It relied on foresight and restraint. In the afternoon, when the man stepped outside again to tend the external chamber, Mara accompanied him to the threshold, watching the brief exchange between fire and stone. The flame burned efficiently, contained, its energy captured and redirected rather than released into open air. Snow had drifted high around the chamber, insulating it further, sealing heat where it was needed. What many designs treated as an obstacle had been incorporated as a partner. When he returned inside, Mara asked the question she had been avoiding. What happens to this place? He looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding how much to say. Then he gestured toward the walls, the floor, the buried contours that made the house what it was. This land has been marked, he said, not for anything dramatic. A project, a plan, something sustainable, according to the language they use now. Mara felt the familiar chill, this one unrelated to temperature. She knew the signs, survey flags, zoning adjustments, environmental reviews conducted at a distance. They won't see this as sustainable, he continued. They'll see it as non-compliant. Do they know it's here? She asked. Not yet. But they will. The certainty in his voice was not bitter. It was observational. They'll want to document it, he said, or remove it, or improve it. Improvement is usually the fastest way to break something that works. Mara thought of visitor centers built to educate people about fragile environments, their parking lots expanding year after year. She thought of systems optimized for comfort in average conditions, then abandoned when extremes arrived. And you? She asked. I'll leave when it's time, he said simply. Or I won't. The house will last as long as it needs to. There was no bravado in the statement, no attachment beyond function. The house existed to solve a problem. If the problem ceased to exist, the house could too. That night, the storm reached a severity that would later be described in reports and warnings, but in the moment, it was simply oppressive. Wind drove snow against every surface, burying the landscape deeper, erasing distance entirely. Inside, the temperature remained unchanged. Mara lay awake, listening, her thoughts circling the same conclusion from different angles. This was not a rebellion against systems. It was an indictment of their priorities. The house did not argue. It demonstrated. As she drifted toward sleep, Mara understood with unsettling clarity that the cost of this house was not measured in labor or isolation. It was measured in the willingness to accept that many solutions celebrated as progress were designed to fail quietly, long after responsibility had been reassigned. And she knew, with a certainty that settled as deeply as the heat beneath the floor, that when she eventually left this place, she would not be able to return to the work she had done before without confronting what she had seen here, buried beneath snow and assumptions, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. The storm did not announce its escalation. It simply deepened, layer upon layer, until the distinction between day and night lost any practical meaning. Snow pressed against the buried house with a steady insistence that would have collapsed lesser structures or driven their occupants into constant vigilance. Here, it accumulated into a second skin, sealing the contours of the land and reinforcing what had already been designed to endure. Mara became aware of the change not through cold, but through silence. The wind outside grew so dense, so continuous, that individual gusts vanished into a single, unbroken force. It was the kind of weather that erased margin for error, that turned small oversights into fatal ones. She had studied storms like this in data sets and historical summaries, reading about fatalities in passive language, numbers abstracted from bodies. Living through one was different. The scale of it pressed inward, reminding her how thin the line was between survival and exposure. Inside the house, nothing changed. That realization unsettled her more than if the temperature had fluctuated wildly. The warmth remained steady, distributed evenly, as if the structure were indifferent to the violence outside. She checked her watch repeatedly, marking hours, expecting some sign of strain. None came. The man continued his routines with minimal adjustment, rising at intervals that seemed dictated, not by urgency but by rhythm. When he tended the external chamber, it was with the same measured care as before, no longer, no more frequently. On the second day of the intensified storm, Mara ventured outside with him, roped together as before. The moment the door opened, the world revealed itself as something barely navigable. Visibility shrank to a few meters. Snow drove sideways, stinging exposed skin despite layers of protection. The cold was immediate and aggressive, the kind that stole breath and clarity in equal measure. She thought of the shelters she had inspected during her career, the cabins rated for winter occupancy, the emergency huts placed along trails and in valleys. She imagined their occupants waking every few hours to feed stoves, burning through reserves at an unsustainable rate, watching fuel stacks shrink while the storm showed no sign of abating. She imagined the calculations, the quiet panic, the attempts to ration heat in a climate that did not negotiate. The man completed his task in less than 10 minutes. The fire burned cleanly, efficiently, its energy drawn inward rather than wasted. Snow piled higher around the chamber, insulating it further. When they returned inside, Mara felt the familiar transition, the cold retreating reluctantly, the warmth reclaiming her muscles and breath. "This is when it matters," he said, removing his outer layers. "Not when things are manageable." She nodded, unable to respond immediately. Her mind was already racing ahead, projecting outcomes. A storm of this duration would cut off access entirely. Rescue would be impossible. Communication unreliable. Anyone depending on continuous input would be gambling with time they did not have. As the hours passed, the house demonstrated its resilience not through dramatic proof, but through monotony. Meals were prepared without hurry. Water was warmed using stored heat. The air remained clean, free of smoke or condensation. There was no condensation freezing on walls, no drafts forming as pressure shifted outside. The system absorbed variation and returned consistency. Mara began to understand that this was the true test. Not whether the house could produce heat, but whether it could remove the need for constant attention. Survival, she realized, often failed not because systems stopped working, but because people did. Exhaustion led to mistakes. Vigilance eroded. Night came, and someone slept too deeply. Here, sleep was not an act of courage, it was an expectation. On the third day, the man shared information sparingly, but with precision. He spoke of previous winters, of storms that had lasted longer than this one, of weeks when the outside world had effectively ceased to exist. He did not frame these experiences as ordeals, but as confirmations. Each season reinforced the same conclusion. The system did not rely on endurance. It eliminated the need for it. Mara found herself thinking of the term resilience as it was used in her field, often vaguely, sometimes optimistically, rarely tested. Resilience, in policy documents, meant the ability to recover. Here, it meant the ability to remain unchanged. By the fourth day, news reached them indirectly. The man's weather radio, powered by a small, carefully rationed energy source, caught fragments of transmissions when atmospheric conditions allowed. Warnings issued after the fact. Reports of stranded vehicles, closed passes, power outages cascading across regions unprepared for sustained cold. Emergency shelters reaching capacity. Search and rescue operations suspended due to conditions deemed too dangerous for responders. Mara listened, the words landing with a dull weight. She imagined the infrastructure she had evaluated, the mitigation strategies she had once accepted as adequate. She imagined people trusting systems designed for averages, now facing extremes that exceeded assumptions. Inside the house, the temperature remained unchanged. That contrast gnawed at her, not because it felt unfair, but because it felt avoidable. The knowledge embodied here was not secret. The principles were ancient, cross-cultural, well-documented. What was rare was the willingness to prioritize them over convenience and speed. On the fifth day, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Snow depths outside reached levels that would have immobilized most structures entirely. The house remained accessible because it did not need access. It did not depend on deliveries, on fuel hauled from a distance, on electricity drawn from fragile lines. Mara realized she was witnessing the outcome of a philosophy she had never seen implemented so completely. The house assumed isolation as the default state. Everything else was contingency. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet, the man spoke again, his tone unchanged. "This is why I don't argue," he said. "When people ask why I live this way, arguments are for things that might be wrong." Mara understood the implication immediately. The house was not theoretical. It was evidence. She thought of the development plans she had reviewed, the promises of emergency protocols and backup systems. None of them accounted for the simple fact that during storms like this, help did not arrive. It waited. The storm finally began to weaken on the seventh day. Not abruptly, but with a subtle easing, the wind losing some of its density, snowfall thinning just enough to allow distance to reemerge. When Mara stepped outside again, she saw a landscape transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Drifts towered over familiar features. Paths had vanished entirely. The world had been reset to a simpler, harsher state. Inside, the house bore no sign of the ordeal. That was when Mara understood the full weight of what she had witnessed. This was not an alternative lifestyle. It was an answer to a question most systems refuse to ask. What happens when conditions stop being exceptional and start being normal? As the storm receded, leaving behind the work of digging out and recalibration, Mara felt a shift within herself that no data set could capture. She knew she would leave this place. She knew the house might not remain. But the principles it embodied had already taken root, steady and irreversible. Winter had tested the house and found it indifferent to spectacle. It had tested her as well, stripping away the language of mitigation and revealing a simpler truth beneath. Survival was not about enduring extremes. It was about designing so that extremes no longer mattered. And that realization, once formed, would not release her easily. When the storm finally released its grip on the mountains, it did so without ceremony. There was no clear moment that marked its end, no dramatic clearing of clouds or sudden blaze of sunlight. Instead, the wind loosened its hold a little at a time, snow falling more gently, then not at all, until distance returned to the world in hesitant increments. The silence that followed was different from the silence of pressure. It carried space within it. It allowed for movement. Mara noticed the change before she saw it. The house responded first, not by altering its temperature or rhythm, but by allowing the outside to reassert itself as something other than a constant threat. The man stood near the entrance for a long time that morning, listening, as though verifying a calculation he had already completed. When he finally opened the door, the cold that entered was sharp but brief, no longer the overwhelming force it had been days before. The landscape beyond was almost unrecognizable. Snowdrifts had reshaped the terrain, erasing old contours and inventing new ones. Familiar markers were gone, buried under meters of accumulation. Trees bent under weight they would carry for weeks to come. It was the kind of aftermath that filled incident reports and retrospective analyses, the kind that prompted questions about preparedness and response times. Standing there, Mara felt the strange dissonance of having lived through something catastrophic without ever feeling endangered. The work of departure began quietly. There was no packing frenzy, no rush to reclaim movement. The man moved through the house with the same calm efficiency as always, checking nothing that did not require checking, adjusting nothing that did not need adjustment. The system did not need resetting. It had not been strained. Mara prepared her own gear slowly, aware that this was not a place she would leave unchanged. The weight she felt was not reluctance, but responsibility. She knew, with a clarity that left little room for doubt, that returning to her former work unchanged would be a form of erasure. She could not unsee what she had seen. She could not unknow the difference between survival by endurance and survival by design. They shared a final meal without commentary. Conversation, when it occurred, remained practical. The weather forecast, snow stability, the likely state of the trail beyond the ridge. It was only when Mara shouldered her pack that the man spoke of what would follow, not for her, but for the house. "It will stay as long as it needs to," he said. "After that, it doesn't matter." She considered the words carefully. They were not dismissive. They were precise. "They'll come," she said. It was not a question. Yes. And when they do, they'll see what they're prepared to see. Mara understood the implication immediately. Without context, the house would appear irregular, unapproved, inefficient by bureaucratic standards. It did not announce its success. It required explanation. and explanations she knew were dangerous things. They invited optimization, replication without understanding, improvement that stripped away the very conditions that made something work. She hesitated, then spoke the question she had been carrying since the storm's peak. "What if I write about it?" He looked at her, not sharply, but attentively. "About the principles," she clarified. "Not this place. Not you. The system. The logic behind it." The man considered this in silence, then nodded once. "Principles don't need permission," he said. "Places do." That answer settled something inside her. It drew a boundary she had been searching for without knowing it. She did not need to save the house. She needed to ensure the knowledge it embodied could not be buried with it. Their parting was brief. There were no promises made, no assurances of return. Mara stepped away from the buried structure and did not look back until she had reached the rise that marked the beginning of her descent. From there, the house was nearly invisible, its presence suggested only by the slightest irregularity in the snow, a softness where the land held warmth. The journey back took longer than expected. Trails were obscured, and progress required careful navigation through terrain altered by the storm. Mara moved deliberately, conserving energy, applying lessons learned not from theory, but from lived experience. Each night, as she made camp, she found herself evaluating her own temporary shelter with new eyes, acutely aware of its limitations, of the assumptions it carried. When she finally reached the outskirts of familiar infrastructure, the contrast was jarring. Roads partially cleared, utility crews working against ice and fatigue, emergency vehicles parked beside structures that had failed under conditions they had been rated to survive. News reports filled the airwaves, recounting the storm in terms of disruption and recovery. Power outages, delayed services, isolated communities. The language was familiar and suddenly insufficient. Back in her office weeks later, Mara sat before a blank document that felt heavier than any report she had written before. She did not begin with location or case study. She did not include photographs or coordinates. Instead, she wrote about assumptions, about the difference between systems designed for average conditions and those designed for extremes, about the cost of continuous input in environments where continuity could not be guaranteed. She described separation of hazard from living space, the use of thermal mass not as an efficiency measure, but as a buffer against human error. The role of natural insulation, not as a barrier to be overcome, but as a collaborator. She wrote of snow not as an enemy, but as one of the most effective insulating materials available when treated with respect rather than fear. She avoided names. She avoided stories. She wrote in a language that could not easily be sensationalized, knowing that attention was both ally and threat. The document she produced was not an exposé. It was a framework, a set of principles grounded in physics, ecology, and restraint. When she submitted it, reactions were mixed. Some colleagues praised its rigor. Others questioned its practicality, its scalability, its relevance to modern development. A few dismissed it outright as impractical, too labor-intensive, too slow. Mara listened to each response without argument. She had learned that arguments were for things that might be wrong. Months passed, then a year. She began to see references to similar ideas emerging quietly in unexpected places. A pilot program for emergency shelters in cold regions that emphasized passive thermal stability over active heating. An academic paper citing historical and cross-cultural approaches to winter habitation. A design proposal for remote research stations that prioritized thermal mass and isolation tolerance. None of these credited her directly. None needed to. The ideas were moving, adapting, settling into new contexts. That was enough. She never returned to the mountains where the house was buried. She followed reports from a distance, learned that the development project had been delayed, then quietly abandoned due to logistical challenges and escalating costs. The land remained classified as protected, not through advocacy, but through disinterest. It was too difficult, too inconvenient. Sometimes, late at night, Mara would think of the house, of the steady warmth beneath stone and snow, of the way it had endured without asking to be noticed. She wondered whether it still stood, whether it had been reclaimed by the land, whether it mattered. What remained, she knew, was not a structure. It was a shift in how survival could be imagined, a refusal to accept quiet failure as inevitable, a reminder that the most resilient systems were often the least visible, and that true sustainability was measured not in certifications or projections, but in the simple fact of enduring when everything else fell silent. In the end, that was what she carried forward. Not a story of discovery, but a lesson in restraint. Not a call for recognition, but an insistence on responsibility. The storm had passed. The house had held. And somewhere between those two truths, a different way of thinking had taken root, patient as stone, waiting for the next winter to test it. If this story made you think differently about survival, design, and responsibility, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and the next one may challenge what you believe even further. Watch our other videos for deeper, human stories hidden in unexpected places, and share this video with someone who values real resilience.